After lunch. Thank you for coming. This panel is really designed to be, in many ways, kind of a hands-on approach to making yourself more secure online and journalists more secure. Before I get into sort of all of that, I've asked my panelists to just introduce themselves and quickly say, you know, basically where they work, what their day job is. So I'll start with you. Just go, Robert. Yeah.
Sure, I'm Robert Jorgensen. I'm the program director for cybersecurity and an assistant professor at Utah Valley University. We are the largest public institution in the state. We have about 37,000 students. We have a new master's program in cybersecurity and have been doing quite a bit of interesting work with NCSA in a saturation campaign to try to get the word out about cybersecurity to our more or less captive population.
Great. And you also, but before that, you came from the private sector, right?
Yes, I spent about 20 years in the private sector. I worked in healthcare for a while. I spent some time at a startup. I also worked for Novell back in the early 2000 era on their security products, such as Border Manager and some of their VPN cryptographic programs and things like that.
Great.
Hi, my name is Stephan Cobb. I'm a senior security researcher at ESET. That is a senior security researcher. We have several of them. It doesn't mean I'm the oldest. And ESET is one of the world's largest security software companies. It's based in Bratislava, Slovakia, where it originated 30 years ago. I am actually in San Diego, where we host all of the customer care and support and marketing for North America. We have large operations down in Latin America, based in Buenos Aires. I've been with ESET for about 6 years. I got into security by writing about it. So back in 1991, I wrote a book about computer security. And apparently, if you write a book about something, people assume you know what you're talking about. And so I have been trying to make that true ever since.
And I'm Stephan Somogyi. I work for Google and work in a bunch of different security and privacy-related projects and products. Right now, I'm working on Chrome things, on sort of next-generation Chrome security and privacy features.
Great. And let's, I obviously, this is, a panel, and I have questions, but I think part of the goal of this is to really answer your questions today. So if anybody has a question, you can walk up anytime. If somebody says something and you're like, well, what does that mean? How do you do that? I mean, I didn't quite get that. Please, stand up and ask your questions. I think panels like this, especially with this particular topic, are, really here designed not only to talk about what people are doing, but mostly to answer your questions. So please ask away. Don't be shy. We would love to engage with the audience in a robust way. But let me start. We say, in a way, by default, right, that employees, journalists, and other employees of publishing companies are at greater risk of being targeted, right? We see them as a high-risk population when it comes to cybersecurity. Can you talk about this a little bit, and why are journalists at risks, and from who? Like, what is it that they need to protect themselves that maybe, the average person on the street doesn't? I mean, they're certainly going to be at risk from all the normal stuff that we all are, but they're at expanded risk. So maybe I don't know who has a perspective on that. I'm not going to any necessary order here. You can sort of answer as you see fit. Go ahead.
Okay. I mean, journalists research things, and journalists often discover very uncomfortable truths, and these truths are uncomfortable both to corporate entities and sometimes to government entities. And so particularly in Latin America, the thing that concerns me the most, particularly in this context, is it is not uncommon in Latin America for journalists to get murdered. And so physical security should take paramount importance. I always worry in contexts like this whether it's disingenuous for us to be sitting here on stage talking about computers and security when people are actually getting killed for some of this stuff. So just to make it very, very clear priority-wise, this is one component, and it's a component that's increasingly important over time, precisely because the attackers are getting more sophisticated, because it's more easy to attack someone's online life and extract information from it in a way that's less attributable, and that can, in fact, be misdirected and redirected towards somebody else. So this whole notion of information operations has gone from military intelligence to very much the day-to-day life and reality of many journalists out there. And so certainly from our perspective, and you know, we build systems that protect billions of people at a time. We also build systems that protect individual people at a time. And so we take this entire continuum very, very seriously because we realize how much people rely on the integrity of their accounts.
Well, I think that's a very good way to set the scene because, yes, there's a seriousness to a journalist's life which goes beyond their cyber identity, but they're targeted, I think, as more than perhaps many other groups, in that you might be investigating local corruption, you might be investigating politicians, you might be investigating a business that's corrupt, and you might be antagonizing your government. And so you're actually sort of coming at you from multiple sides. And one of the things that I see as important in understanding cybersecurity and what you as a person need to do is the concept of risk management, understanding your risk and understanding where the risks are coming from. And for a journalist, this depending on what you write about, this could be quite a broad range of directions at which attacks may come. Somebody may be trying to discredit you or get your information or find out what you're researching. And when you look at the attackers that you face, one of the things that we try to do is assess their capabilities. So we talk about a well-funded attacker, a threat actor with resources. So the more resources the threat actor has, then the more dangerous in a way they become, or the more likely it is that they will have the resources to overcome your defenses. And so I'm thinking, for example, we've heard in Mexico of potentially the Mexican government paying for commercial spying software. And all our governments have spying software, and we sometimes contract out to get that. But then if the government is using it is not using it for the defense of the nation, but using it for enforcement of its policies or helping out its friends, this commercial software is very, very difficult. And just to be clear, because I often get this, my company makes anti-malware, used to be called Antivirus, but we try to keep other people's code off your machines. We do not give a free pass to any government malware we find. So, you know, we find in our work, the attacks are coming in, that come in the form of malicious code, are coming from criminals, but they're sometimes coming from nation-state actors or nation-state friendly actors. And you know, we do our best to defend against that and help you defend against it, but it's something as a person protecting your identity and your work, you need to think about who is coming after you and what resources do they have.
I think those are all good points, and we're talking a lot about kind of protecting yourself as a journalist, but I think one thing that needs to also be brought up, not just from a security and safety perspective, but of an information perspective, and one of you mentioned, you know, discrediting somebody, and when we keep so much information online in digital format, we're doing all this correspondence with our sources via email, other things like that, there's a great potential for somebody to find that information, manipulate you as a journalist, impersonate your sources, discredit you, impersonate you, various things like that. So I think in addition to this concept that we need to protect your safety, which you know, is paramount, I think that everybody's life is probably more important than their reputation. But when we're talking about, you know, reputation and sources and things like that, we have to be able to verify who we're talking to, and this information is genuine. And with digital information, we saw this in the 2016 US elections, it's pretty easy to generate a lot of misinformation and disinformation. And when the press is really the voice of the people, if that information is compromised, you know, the ramifications are just so far-reaching.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. You know, as we say here in the United States, the cat's out of the bag in terms of the digital world, right? I mean, news is online, reporters are online, they're doing research online, they're communicating with sources, probably electronically in many cases, or people are trying to deliver to them documents or information electronically, and so that's happening, right? That's a given. That's just going to happen. So when you put yourself in the shoes of of a journalist or a publisher who's trying to protect a journalist, because I think that's what some of the audience we have here today, where do you start to understand this increased risk and start to build protections around those risks? I mean, you mentioned risk management, right, which is what we advocate for from at a organizational level too, right? You know, every organization needs to mitigate and manage their risk, but they have to start by understanding it, right?
Yes, I think, you know, as an organization, it's an ongoing process. So hopefully a lot of publishers are already engaged in this process of, you know, understanding how to protect their digital assets. But yes, you need to constantly reevaluate that assessment of what is the risk. One of the issues that certainly we saw in the United States around, for example, healthcare information, is that it took a long time for doctors and nurses to realize that criminals would come after their information. And you know, if, for example, I carry out a ransomware attack against a hospital, that could endanger somebody's life. Well, criminals don't care about that. They're part of a fairly industrialized process of making money online. And so when I would go out and talk to healthcare organizations about the measures they should take, there was sort of disbelief, and I couldn't kind of connect that. And then I saw, okay, they don't understand what a machine the cybercrime world is, and how many people are involved in it, and how persistent they are in attacking. And so a realistic assessment of your threats is you know, the first step. Then look at the measures you need that would be appropriate to respond to that.
Did anybody else want to respond to that in any way before we go to the question?
I mean, I agree absolutely with what Stephen just said. Fundamentally is you have to understand the incentives of the attacker. You need to understand your own incentives. What are you protecting? From whom are you protecting? How long does it need to be protected? Because some information has half-life. You might only need to keep it secret for a week. Right. That's a very different set of boundaries to the greater problem than something that you want to keep secret for 20 years or in perpetuity. And when I interact with journalists, when I spend time with them to understand both what they're concerned about and what they should be concerned about, there often is a significant chasm between those two things. People get very, very excited about the James Bond stuff, and that's very human nature. They want to talk about the encryptions, and they want to talk about all of this really wonderful techno-gadgetry. But the thing that's going to get you and your sources and your people in trouble is the mundane, is the boring stuff. You know, when you learn how to drive, knowing how to use the brake pedal is extremely important, and people will die if you don't know how to do that. But really, if you are into driving, you want to drive a very high-performance vehicle. You have much greater interest in the shiny. Security is the same way. There's shiny stuff that sounds really cool. That's why everybody goes and sees James Bond movies. Or, you know, pick any mystery that you've ever read. Humans really like a good detective story. And ultimately, it turns out the technology is much less interesting and much less important than the humans. And so very frequently, I describe myself as a security humanist, because understanding human motivation and understanding the attacker's human motivation, which often is a profit motive. Certainly, organized crime is all about generating profit. But when you have attackers who are not organized crime, typically they don't care as much about the money. They really do want the information. So you need to know who your attacker is. You need to know who you are and understand what you want to protect and what you don't want to protect, and then you go from there. It's a very cold, calculating, ruthless thing. It shouldn't be tales of daring do.
Go ahead. We have to take a question? Yeah, we got to turn that mic on, please. Not yet. Like we said, we like the shiny technology, and they're working on that over there.
That's
well, I mean, and the workaround is he
microphone.
could just raise his voice. There aren't so many of us. I could sit here and I could just yell, and then everybody would hear me, even in the background.
I might never have figured that out, the tape. Is it inherently safer or less safe to keep your private information on your laptop or your cell phone or your flash drive or in the cloud?
Okay. Personal security of your own devices versus the security that might come from somewhere else that you participate in.
Google.
It depends. I mean, I think very much riffing on what all of us have said at various points along the way, it depends on what's your threat, who you're worried about, who's within your threat model. If your cloud provider is within your threat model, then that's something that you need to factor in. If you are worried about duress that can be placed upon a service provider, that's something you need to consider. More often than not, the service provider is unlikely to be the weakest link in any of these chains. So is it inherently safer? It depends on the information as well. Depends on how you store it. I certainly would put my 750-odd colleagues worldwide who are dedicated to security and privacy up against any nation state out there in the world. So there's merit and there's economic reasoning that you can apply to saying the cloud is most secure. But I always come back with most secure for what? Just saying, personal information can be, pictures from a baby shower from last week. Personal information can also be, detailed genetic information that will identify a hereditary illness that might affect you and your family. And those are two bits of personal information that have widely differing importances, half-lives, all of these things. So I can't give you a definite answer because it's a very broad question.
One of the things I want to mention with that is that when we talk about whether the device is safe or the cloud, that sort of thing, while there's certainly questions about the information's being protected, there's also questions of how you're doing these things, right? You can put something on Google, in Google's cloud, has great encryption, all kinds of things, and your password is 123456. And it's the same password you used on LinkedIn when it was compromised 6 or 7 years ago, and anybody could look up your email address and that password. So in that case, it's not so good. Now, if you've got a strong password and strong authentication, it's probably going to be pretty hard to get into. And likewise with your devices, if you have a laptop and you've got local encryption on it and you've got full disk encryption and a good passphrase, it's pretty unlikely that a casual attacker is going to grab that and build a cluster with nation state resources to decrypt your laptop. However, if you don't encrypt your laptop and you leave it in a bar somewhere, that's a completely different situation. So I think there's just so many variables as to say which one's best, which one's most secure, and really it comes down to how you use it. I think that in all of these cases, there are really secure ways to use any kind of device, but you've got to put that effort into it and take a moment to think about what you're doing on your side rather than purely the technology.
Yeah, I think we get this asked a lot in a business context because obviously for, say, smaller businesses, using the cloud as their business computing platform is appealing. And what we find is, the cloud is a very fuzzy term, right? It's not a concrete term, and it's one that, unfortunately, you can't just say the cloud versus something else. It's what kind of cloud? How are you using it? And there are private clouds. We, as a company, have a private cloud. It is a space that's out there on the internet, but it's on systems that we entirely own ourselves. A public cloud is something like Amazon or Google, which if you're going to use that, you do have, and I think there's a lot of merit to the argument that somebody like Amazon or Google is going to spend a lot more time on security than your small business would or you as a person would. But then you as a small business or a person have this responsibility that both Robert and Stephan have alluded to. You've got to do it properly, and instead of just a password, use, if it's provided, that second factor of authentication. Make sure that you're alerted, and I know Google does this quite well, is if something changes or somebody's trying to access my account from somewhere else, it will tell me. It's me. In fact, I think every time so far it's been me. It's like, someone tried to access your account from Utah. Well, that was me, that was okay. But I don't turn that off because that's very helpful. And so, yeah, it's you participating as well in an understanding, certainly, what the cloud is. I've got a friend who does consulting in the States. We're in the States, Stephen. Okay. Does consulting in Nevada. Somebody told a friend of his, told their business that they were going to put everything in the cloud so it would be safe. And he didn't need antivirus or password protection or encryption on his laptops anymore because the security was being done in the cloud. Which meant that my friend could walk into a laptop there, get onto it, and get into the cloud because it was all logged in. You know, so you have to understand if somebody says, oh, we're giving you the cloud, it's secure, there's a truth to that, but it's got to be translated relative to your specific use.
Great, I think we have another question over here, so we'll go to that. I love it, keep the questions coming.
Fabricio Altamirano, El Salvador. I actually have two questions. One is, Google helped us develop the SHIELD project, which was to combat the denial of service attack. So I'm going to take it to the enterprise level. What is the other or the next danger to publishers that you can see of that nature, of that large scale nature, beyond what the denial of service addresses? Is that a question? What is the other nature of attack that we should be aware of?
You're not going to like this answer. I will tell you this now. The answer, at least my opinion, and I know that many of my colleagues share it, is individual apathy of somebody within an organization. So so who here knows what a distributed denial of service attack is? Okay, for those of you who don't, just so we're all talking approximately the same language, the idea behind, and this is abbreviated to DDoS because, of course, in technology we love acronyms. A DDoS attack floods a server with so many requests for stuff that it basically can't keep up. It's like you haven't slept for days and you have 15 small children, each individually demanding attention from you. You simply cannot keep up. So that's what that kind of attack is, except it's at a very, very large scale. And the direct result is that the website, for example, of a publisher, of a newspaper, of a news organization, is no longer responsive. It's no longer providing news. So you're essentially taking a megaphone and shouting so loudly that you can't actually hear the news. So that's one of many, many kinds of attacks that you can launch on a news organization. Relatively speaking, that class of attack is relatively rare. It's easy to do, it's super cheap to do, but at this point everybody knows about them, and anybody who has a large amount of infrastructure has defenses against it. We provided, in the context of Project SHIELD, for free for qualifying news organizations worldwide, because we have to build it for ourselves anyway. When you speak of enterprise, our enterprise customers want exactly the same sort of protection. They are having to pay for it. So the Project SHIELD infrastructure, it exists anyway. We're just making it available to a broader range of users who don't necessarily pay for it in this context. What scares me next is all the hard stuff. Technology is extremely good at shooting yourself in the foot. It is a tool. If you misuse the tool, every one of us has taken a hammer and at some point along the way missed the nail and hit a finger. Technology is a lot like that. You can misuse it accidentally through ignorance, and it hurts. Where it gets scary for journalists and for publishers and for editors and for stringers and for everybody in the entire chain of publication until you get a sensitive story out is if any one of those people is inattentive and isn't really paying attention, that's where your risk comes from. Sometimes the risk is outside of your organization. We've seen plenty of media organizations have leaks that have nothing to do inside their organization. It was a partner organization that they had no control over, but they had a piece of that information. They were able to leak it because there was no requirement for them to be more secure, or they were a service provider. This happens in the entertainment industry and post-production houses, where it's like you've finished a thing, it is your thing, but you have to hand it to a partner, and they're working on it, and oops, they leaked.
Can I ask a quick follow-up on that? And you might all want to add this, and we'll get to you in a second, Matt, with your question. But so we get the question about risk a lot, right? So DDoS attacks that we're risk at now. What's the next big risk? But I often feel like what's missing in that question is understanding what the motivation is, right? So I think that's an important part of evaluating the risk, because a DDoS attack, the risk, the motivation is maybe you're about to publish something that I don't want published, right? And so it's a tool for doing that, but there are other motivations that people are looking at. So I don't know if you could speak to some of that a little more, because I think there is some more granular risk here than just like what's the risk of what's the risk flavor of the month, right?
Right. So I think, you know, one of the things, well, from our perspective as a company that looks at malicious code out there, the biggest sort of engine for badness, a colleague of mine uses the term cyber badness. Yeah, the biggest engine for that is the botnet, which is a collection of digital devices that are connected to the internet under the control of a bad actor. And a bad actor can use those to do a denial of service attack, and they might do it because they don't want a story to come out. But if you have a store online, you know how much per hour you spend. You know how much per hour you spend to generate the revenue. You know how much revenue you make from that store. It's not unusual for a retailer, an online retailer, to get a phone call saying, we need $5 million or we'll take your website down for X amount of time. And in some cases, the retailer pays because they know paying's cheaper than losing the business. And by the way, if you get that call and you say, I don't believe you, then they do show you how they can take it down, which is a good way to test your defenses if you have some or don't. But I think it's a good point. The motive can be political, it can be financial, it can also be just nastiness. I mean, we saw recently attacks in the Ukraine which looked like they were ransomware, but turned out to be simply destroying information. So there you had like a political motive for it. And I think in the risk process, you have to think, what kind of publication are we? You know, what are we covering, and why would somebody want to get at that? And then what tools could they use? And a DDoS attack is one. You have to decide. I think in terms of the gentleman's question about what comes next, which Stefano sort of alluded to, is supply chain attacks. So what we're seeing there is, like the production, you send something to post-production, they don't have as good security as you do. You send your magazine out, you spent a lot of time making this magazine beautiful, it goes to somewhere where somebody's unethical and they leak it. But the other form of supply chain is in the software supply chain. And there we've seen a couple of examples recently where a legitimate application was taken over by a bad actor and used to infect systems. We saw this in Ukraine where a popular piece of accounting software was compromised by bad actors. They put their code in the update to the accounting software, and that spread something we might have heard about called WannaCry. So or maybe it was not Petya, I don't know. That happens. We saw it recently on the Mac. A piece of malware called Proton was spread by a media player on the Macintosh. So the bad guys will keep evolving their attacks. You have to keep evolving your threat model.
Matt, did you have a question?
Perfect. Okay, there we go. Matt Sanders, President of the Inter-American Press Association. Really glad that you're here. Michael, great to see you. I'm sorry we missed the earlier one. I was pulled away in 3 different directions and could only do 2 of them. So good to see you. Thanks for being here. Really appreciate the support of Google and all of our ongoing efforts at the IPA as well. As you know, this is actually an early stage beginning discussion at IAPA, the concept of cybersecurity. We're at the front end of a public health campaign, as it were. Michael, you've been very instructive with me in helping us understand kind of how to position this in our organization and in our member companies, and as a result, our countries and the people we serve. And so, as I think about this, though, I love your thoughts about, as media companies, how do we prioritize our efforts to have the greatest impact as we begin to invest in the most important capabilities first to the most expansive capabilities and our effect on the public good of cybersecurity. And the way that I see it, you're probably far more sophisticated than I am about this, but there's individual cybersecurity. There's your, with respect to media companies in particular, there's individual cybersecurity, individual devices, multiple individual devices, but then there's the system of colleagues and the systems that we manage within our media companies. And then beyond that, as media companies, we have sources that require protection. And then beyond that, we also have our users, our clients, who interface with our sites. Where do you start? That's quite an ecosystem, right? So we really are a nexus of information gathering, information management, and information distribution. Where should some of these organizations begin some of their work in this fairly sophisticated, complicated public or cybersecurity health problem?
So there are a few frameworks out there, like the Center for Internet Security's 20 security controls, that basically address some of these things, because when it comes down to it, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in these organizations. And a lot of people look at the problem of cybersecurity and say, well, what are we going to do with a nation-state attacker who's going to write custom malware to take out our things, when you don't have good password policies, or you have unencrypted flash drives, and things like that. So I think really the place to start is looking at one of these frameworks. There are a number out there, and start with the basic steps there. If we take the 20 critical security controls, their first 2 steps are to take an inventory. What are your software? What are your hardware assets? And that goes to part of when we're talking about this whole risk management thing. What information are you trying to provide? And you mentioned this entire ecosystem, and hopefully going through that process, you'll start to identify which information is the most critical to address, which is maybe less critical, and then you can prioritize where you want to spend your time and your money, because honestly, cybersecurity is a time-consuming, expensive process to do fully, but there's some great things you can do to address this low-hanging fruit, because not everybody is going to be taken down by that nation-state actor with custom malware. So many people are going to be taken down by, say, not patching Apache struts in March, even though there was a big vulnerability, which is what happened to Equifax. So, and whether that was because they didn't have good inventory and asset control, I don't know, but it's one of these things where even large organizations that aren't taking care of the small things can just have huge effects. So that's what I'd say is, start with the small, easy stuff, and then worry about the more sophisticated stuff as time goes on.
I would also try and talk to as many of your peer organizations as possible. There are quite a few out there who have gone through some of these, especially for very, very large newsrooms. Different newsrooms with different focuses tend to often have different sets of priorities, and it's very useful to swap experiences. Generally speaking, communication among peers is a very, very good thing, because it will help you understand also what may be going on, if there's anything that's systematic that's going on out there. But I also think it's really important, start with what does the most good for the most people, including your customers, your readership, your viewership, depending on the nature of your media, but also take a very, very educational approach. And whatever you do, embrace all the things that we know about pedagogy. Don't shame people. If individual employees have poor security practices, go out of your way not to point and laugh at them. Find ways to help them. Find ways, because even if their work accounts are hardened, let's say you are state-of-the-art on the work side, a determined adversary is going to say, okay, fine, that's a detour sign. I'm going to go after their personal accounts. And we've seen this. This happens in the political realm. This happens in the media realm. So, and we've done, we have the good fortune that we have the resources. We've done a bunch of research, and we found a huge chasm of understanding and misunderstanding between what individual non-experts believe and what experts believe. And there are things in the top 5 of what non-experts think they should be doing, which do not appear in the top 10 for what the experts are doing. And again, it comes back to what I was saying earlier about the mundane stuff. Number one thing, for instance, during that research, this was happening in late 2015, and it's still valid today. Number one thing on the expert side is accept your software updates. But I'm here to tell you, journalists are among the most stubborn people in the world when it comes to software updates, because their computer works just the way they like it right now. And they're not going to change anything because you can't make them. So you need to sit down, particularly with the intransigent people, because they can become your allies. You don't want to frighten them, because fear stops rational thought. And this really needs to be a concerted, very analytical approach. You need to say, look, if you don't think it's important for you, what about your colleagues? Herd immunity is a thing, even in this context. And so even if you're a journalist who doesn't believe that you are working on stories that have that kind of impact, I guarantee a colleague working on those stories is more likely to open an email from you than from some random person out on the intertubes. And if you get compromised, you then become the vector by which your colleague is compromised. Do you want that on your conscience? And I've had some very difficult conversations with extremely obstinate journalists. But when you say, look, even if it's true and you are unimportant, do you really want the responsibility of causing trouble for your colleague who's working on something that's a really, really big story? And that tends to focus their minds. So it is about, it's very much about human behavior. It's very much about understanding economics. Right. It's about understanding risk. And I feel like I'm monologuing, so please, John.
No, I would just, you said a number of things that I would have said. Education to me, I think, if you say, where do you start? I think that's fairly close to the top of the list, in that anything you do to improve the knowledge and understanding of your employees about security is going to help. It has a ripple effect. It will lead people to think about things and bring security issues to you in management. It is definitely a key factor. And what I found over time is that if you tell your employees you have to come to a security training session, you couldn't get them to come, or you had to bribe them with t-shirts and food. Today, if you take the approach and you make it about both those personal devices and the work devices, everybody's a computer user, and nobody wants their baby photos to be encrypted for ransomware. If you go out with the right message about come to this security awareness session, and you'll learn some useful stuff to protect your family and your privacy and your work, you can sell training much better than before. And there's a lot of free stuff out there too, educational-wise. There are some very good websites which have training courses on them that you can do for free, a lot of free materials that you can use, so it doesn't have to be expensive. And I would say, if you can identify one person in your organization who becomes kind of the evangelist on security, that one person can get a whole lot done. If you find someone who likes doing that, it can make a big difference.
Let me just add to this. We always talk about creating that culture of cybersecurity in an organization, right? So that everybody does their part. And to the herd immunity issue, we have a phrase that we use a lot, that everything that you do to be safer online makes everyone around you more secure. And that's the heart of the matter to what you were speaking about, right? Like when I protect myself, I'm not just protecting myself, I'm protecting Robert right next to me, right? So, because he's going to be a little more secure because I am. So we have another question. We got great questions here. So I have some other questions for you, and I'll make sure we get to some of these, but let's keep going to these.
Thank you very much. My name's Alejandro Aguirre. I'm a former president of the organization. One of the hats that I wear is I'm on the board of directors of a community bank, and the bank regulators require us to audit several times a year our cybersecurity, and we're a small bank. And I was wondering if you thought that there was value, especially in the mid to smaller organizations, to actually have an audit function of your cybersecurity to try to catch things that maybe you think you're doing, or you think you bought and is working just fine, and maybe is not, or if it's not worth it in your mind.
Well, I would use an analogy that I've used in the past, but it just happens to be really good here. You typically don't let a journalist publish something without it going through an editor, all right? Because it doesn't matter how good you are at writing, you're going to make mistakes which you as the writer don't understand or you don't see. I mean, I've done it myself many, many, many times. I thought, oh, I'll just put this on our website, and I go, oh my gosh, there's a typo in there. The same thing is kind of true in security. You can have good security people who are doing, are working hard and diligently to make you secure, but if they don't have some outside perspective on that, they may not see issues. And so I'm a big believer in having an outside look at your security. Now, whether that's you call that an audit, or you have a penetration test done by outsiders, it is a very valuable thing to go through. And there are now, certainly in America, some regulations. I believe the PCI credit card security regulations include a pen test requirement, pen being penetration test, where basically you get somebody to act like a hacker to see if they can find their way in. That will reveal things that you may have missed internally. And a good pen test will help you fix those very quickly. An audit can be pretty much the same thing. One of the things that you don't want to get into the habit of, though, is having a checklist. To say, okay, well, we've got encryption, we've got antivirus, we've got two-factor authentication. Just to say you have them isn't enough. You want somebody to look and make sure that reality matches your policy.
I think one thing to realize is that right now, regardless of what organization you're with, there's somebody auditing or testing your security right now. And if you're not paying them, the freelance tests are usually not done for your benefit. So one thing that I worry about a lot when you start talking about audits and things like this is you get this idea of compliance and the check boxes you're talking about. And you end up, you tick this box, you tick that box, you tick that box, and you're not getting a holistic view of what's going on. My personal philosophy with that, from my time in industry, is that rather than chasing those check boxes to comply with whatever regulations apply to your industry, being in healthcare, I had lots and lots of regulations to deal with. But if you do the right things and try to basically build that culture of security, put in the right technical controls, things like that, a lot of those boxes are going to check themselves. And when you get down to actually having an audit done, it's going to be a lot better experience because it's not just this laundry list of things that you need to do. It's going to be the few things that you've overlooked, or even something that someone from the outside notices that no one else saw because they're too close to it. So I'm a big fan of that. I know it's expensive, but part of the thing you need to do before that is you need to work on that stuff before you bring somebody in. It's like you take your car to the mechanic and you're like, it doesn't run. And they say, well, you haven't put gas in it. That's $300, please. You need to take care of these simple things that you could do and know where to start. That way, when you do have somebody audit or do a pen test, you're getting your money's worth because you're not starting with the, hey, we don't know anything, because obviously they're going to find a lot of problems. So start addressing it and then bring in somebody else. But as was mentioned by Stephen, PCI and all that, there are a lot of regulatory requirements that require that kind of audit, but I don't think that should be the main driver. I think security itself should be what you're looking for, and those are just a tool to make sure you're getting there.
I'm going to be even more blunt and say, regulatory compliance is your minimum bar, because without that, your regulator is going to shut down your business. So yes, absolutely, do what you need to do to achieve regulatory compliance. Do not labor under the illusion that that gives you security. All that does is give you regulatory compliance so that your regulator doesn't shut you down. That's all you're getting. That is the quid pro quo in that particular value exchange, such as it is. If you really want security, find the people who care about security, whether they're external or internal, and get them engaged and figure out what it is that you're actually trying to achieve. Because here in the US, there's a hugely broad range of how retail banks deal with authentication. Today, I have better authentication in most massively multiplayer online games than I do with most retail banks in the United States. This is common, and this has been the case for the better part of the last decade, because these big gaming companies understand very, very well how easily their customers can go someplace else, and they understand the time investment in playing. So there's great value to the customer to playing this game. So they had some very, shall we say, startling experiences with user churn in the late noughties, which was what got them onto this. But today, there's no regulator telling banks what they need to do in order to be, best practices for authentication, and it's up to the banks to decide how much fraud loss they're willing to eat in order to prevent churn. What you need to decide as part of your organization is, do you want to differentiate yourself on security, and if so, what are the best practices? If not, maybe regulatory compliance is okay, but then we get back to herd immunity, then something that suddenly is just an increment above minimal compliance, and you have breaches in a whole bunch of different banks, and then FDIC isn't going to help you.
So I want to come back to. Do you have a question? Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. I have some follow-ups for you. Okay. I'll wait on this other question I was about to ask you, but I do have this question because I can't remember who raised it here, but I think because I want to get back to sort of the individuals at some point and protecting them, but I think there's an interesting thing that's gone on in the U.S., and I don't know if this is true among publishers across Latin America, but industries have banded together, right, because they have maybe some simple things. Maybe they're running the similar software, right? Maybe they're, as an industry, they're doing certain things that they're doing in common, and they're sharing information about threats and risks and also best practices within their sectors. And I don't know if that's something that happens among publishers in Latin America, but I don't know if someone wants to comment on sort of that. Part of the herd immunity is also creating a new herd, right? So in the United States, I'll just give a quick example. After the Target data breach, which was humongous, gigantic, right? The retail industry, which is an incredibly competitive industry, came together to create their own, what they call the risk, but it's basically an information sharing center, right? Where as an industry, they share the risks that they all have. They can compete for customers, come my store versus your store. But on security, they decided that they needed to share that information. And I don't know if that's something that's happening or if the IAPA is looking at in terms of cybersecurity, in terms of that collective, maybe, I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that or that kind of notion of shared information sharing?
Well, I certainly don't know if there is something like that. Typically in America, we call it an ISAC. Right. And we have them for different, as you said, sectors. But that would be a great thing to do in journalism. And I'm not aware of anybody doing that. But I tend to think of IT security or cybersecurity as being the healthcare of technology. And it's an area where it's possible to come together even though you're competing with people and help each other. Because, when there was the Target hack, Target shares took a hit, but the industry got soiled as well. We have 3 credit reporting bureaus in America, and the Equifax got hit was one of them. The other 2 aren't going, hooray, because all 3 of them are really under the spotlight now. So, I think that's a very good idea.
So I know that information sharing happens informally, just so you know, but there's nothing as consistent, also because the environments are very different country to country. It's very difficult, it's straightforward to do an ISAC for a given industry sector in one country because at least the baseline is the jurisdiction. It starts getting really, really hairy when you do globally.
Yeah. I just want to, I logged into something you said, Stephan, that you were a security humanist. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? Because I thought that was a startling concept, and there's a lot more to it, evidently, behind your comment.
Well, I'm going to rely on the moderator to whack me upside the head if I talk too long, because I can spend a long time on this. Ultimately, security is a function of people. It has nothing to do with this technology stuff. We can build better technology. I mean, the difference today, if you buy a new device, whether it's Android or iOS or Windows or Mac, it doesn't matter. Out of the box today, these devices are much more secure than they were even 5 years ago. The likelihood of you easily succumbing to a compromise is very small. And so because we are all economists at heart, we look at where do the attacks come from. And we can fix the technology, we can do software updates, we can do all this stuff, and that's sort of become the baseline. The thing that we cannot protect as well are the people. And the problem is criminals know this, and criminals for hundreds of years have been extremely capable at tricking people. And so most of the attacks that we see right now, both at large scale and at small scale, are tricking people. It's cheating. It's getting somebody to do something that is not in their own interest by tricking them into thinking that it is. And so malware over time is less of a concern per person, per 100 people, per 1,000 people. But phishing is not going away. Phishing is tricking somebody into disclosing their account credentials. And so we're in a somewhat unique position because, you know, we have a couple of users, and they're all over the world, and they send and receive a lot of emails. So we have a perspective on what this looks like when you have multiple billions of human beings using all these devices and using all these services. So we're able to take a lot of these resources that we have and secure people at massive scale. But the problem is, what do you do to protect the individual human being for whom, if their account is compromised, maybe they're a journalist working on something and they have evidence that's electronic about some profound corruption somewhere that people are quite happy to kill to prevent from getting out. And they're not ready to kill this journalist until they can get the evidence that this journalist has this information. So they compromise that account. So we start looking into not the billion scale stuff, but what happens to the individual? How do we protect the individual in a way that doesn't require them to become an expert? And so this is, within the last 2 weeks, we've released a thing. It's a both hardware and software and some philosophy called advanced protection. And I have a colleague just outside that's handing out these little white boxes with these kits in it. This is our current answer to how to make people less phishable. But in order to secure yourself, we are also giving you the opportunity to create a great deal of difficulty for yourself, because the attackers, when they're phishing you, they're trying to get into your account, right? And they will always use the easiest method that they can to get into your account. With what we've done now, we make it very difficult for somebody outside to get into it, but we also make it equally difficult for you to get back into it if you are careless. Yeah, see? There's no such thing as a free lunch. So if we create a system that is highly protective of the individual person, with that comes the responsibility to not be goofy about it. You know, you can only lose so many instances of your car keys before it kind of turns into a problem, because then you can't get into your car anymore. And so that's why, you know, with these kits, we have 2 of these keys in there, and they are literally these hardware physical keys. And my colleague Dario will explain it all to you, and it's really kind of cool. But fundamentally, we had to make a decision that we could not have made this decision 5 years ago, because 5 years ago, our thinking about users is you must never prevent the user from getting at their account.
Right.
And particularly if you have people, yeah, so this is what it looks like, and there's boxes of them out there. But you know, the number one thing is always, always have a way for the user to get at their data, because that's the most precious thing. We are the stewards of this data. But we've now gotten to the point where we need to provide the tools so that the users can protect their data so well that if the user is careless, not even they can get at it. And that is a profound change that has just happened recently.
And this is not for everybody, right?
Absolutely not.
Right. So who is this for?
Anybody who is at risk. And I'm not, you know, journalists would fall into that bucket, but there are lots of people, for instance, who have entire organizations dedicated to protecting their information security at work. But these are people who actually have human relationships outside of work. They have families. They might even have children and grandchildren. And they need electronic mechanisms to communicate with them. So all these people, all these highly protected, expensively protected people, have personal accounts. And this is for those people, because we know that the adversary is going to take a look at this really hardened work account and say, I'm not going to bother. Because worst case, there are people with guns who will come and visit me if I try and attack this account too hard, because it's a work account, perhaps of a government official. So the risk to somebody attacking that is relatively high. The risk to them attacking that person's personal account, much lower. So what tools can we provide? But these don't scale because we don't want to give this opportunity for people to shoot themselves in the foot to everybody because it's not necessary. Our goal is to have the highest common denominator account protections for all of our accounts. And this is for the billion scale stuff. But for those people who really have a need because they are at risk for whatever reason, that's why we built that.
I would second that. I would second the fact that it does add some labor. My wife's been playing around with keys and two-factor authentication. But if you look at how our company approaches security, I've got my company computer back here. If you took it off me, it'd be very, very hard to do anything with it because the thing is locked down very, very tight. I don't get to put new programs on that, and there are certain websites I can't go to. I can't put in a USB key that's not been properly authorized and so on, which makes life tougher. But that's kind of the trade-off. And I think getting it at the right scale is key because if you lock down too much, too tight for too many people, then you have a high overhead. We also found in things like antivirus, if your antivirus is too slow, then people turn it off and get around it. But I applaud this approach.
And I just want to reemphasize, because I think maybe it wasn't 100% clear, and I think people should understand it. This is not for enterprise-level accounts, right? This is for individual, like Gmail. It's always Gmail. For individual Gmail accounts. So, you have your corporate account. It's, at, whatever.com. But this is for, michael@gmail.com. This is my personal account. So I think that's important to note.
Right, because the features that we provide in here are already features that are available to our enterprise customers, but our enterprise customers have paid admins. They have staff. They have people who do stuff and whose job it is to wrangle this stuff. What we struggled with, and this was an extended period of time to figure out what is this right balance between, it's a double-edged sword. You can cut yourself really easily, is what are the necessary features to prevent at-risk people from getting compromised without putting too much burden on them, but also while acknowledging that some amount of burden is necessary today in 2017.
That's a great point. Okay, we have a question here.
Alberto Puertas from the International Institute of Human Rights. And I love your comment. This is more a comment than a question. When you talk about human relationships, and the bottom line, I guess, is families and people. I'm the father of 3 wonderful teenagers who are rambunctious and who have everything open. And I also belong to an organization that finds human trafficking and child trafficking around the globe. So I welcome what you're doing and how important security is, especially saving children with all these evils that we have around the globe. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to go back another question about I know Google also, so you have the advanced protection like this, that's really important. And I think this doesn't only happen on Google, and if people want to add, other sites, I think sometimes people don't even know the other tools that might even be out there. For example, there's a thing called Security Check, right? Which you just, I think, also upgraded that in the last couple of weeks at the same time. I also just want to say thank you because you did them during National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, which is near and dear to our heart.
Coincidence? We think not.
I think not. Maybe people don't need all of this, but they might not actually know what they're currently doing at all, right? So you want to talk a little about security checks? I think that's a really important tool.
So we have both a security check and a privacy check, and the security check was recently updated, but I don't want to necessarily focus exclusively on all the spiffy and wonderful things that we do, but for instance, Facebook, direct competitor, not a whole lot of love lost between us and them on the business level, but we are absolutely peers on the security side. Facebook also has a privacy checklist, and I believe they have a small version of a security checklist as well. So the important thing to really think about is understand the services that you use and absolutely maximize your use of the security features that they offer. Because in a lot of instances, people, as you say, Michael, people don't know what's there. So I'm sorry if it's inconvenient, I'm sorry if it takes a little time, but educate yourself. Because if you educate yourself, you can teach others. You can teach family members, you can teach colleagues, you can teach peers in whatever set of social structures you have. But a little education and then spreading it out goes a very, very long way. So yes, we have a security check. It's part of our account management system. There's also a separate and distinct privacy check. I think that we are going to start reminding you every so often to do that because it's a good idea, not because it's a collection of checkboxes, because as much as I like the Checklist Manifesto and as much as I think everybody should read that book because there's a lot of really good, useful stuff in it, it can sometimes breed complacency, which is why we change things around in the security checkup to make sure that you do not become complacent. And that's ultimately the goal, is keep thinking. Because I can assure you, very much as Robert was talking about your unpaid external security auditors, there are people out there who are thinking very deliberately and very concertedly about how to compromise your accounts, how to get into your stuff. Best case scenario, it's organized crime and they want access to your contact list so they can send emails with your name on them, which some percentage of your regular correspondence in your contact list are going to just open without thinking, and they're going to open that enclosure, and then they're going to get compromised, and so the chain continues. That's the nicest possible thing that can happen, and it goes downhill from there.
I want to talk about business email compromise, but let's do the question first, and then we can go back.
Yeah, we'll go to the question. We can come back to this topic because I think we should talk about some other sites as well.
Gerardo Reyes, I am the director of the investigative team of the Univision Network. I have a direct question. What Google as a company can know about me beyond a Google search?
That's almost a metaphysical question. I mean, I would like to answer it. It's just genuinely, I don't know where to start. Do you have something specific in mind? Could you make your question a little more precise so I can try and answer it? Because otherwise, I can sit here and talk about all sorts of things.
You have access to some databases and some other material that beyond what you can know about me when you do a Google search?
Based on the way you ask that question, no. But I'm not sure that that's I'm still not sure that I'm understanding your question, and I'm not sure I'm giving you a useful answer.
I'm wondering, so Google builds profiles of people. You can go in and look at your profile, say that, I'm a 40-something-year-old male who's into whatever.
Sure. So we have these things called ads preferences where you can go in there
exactly.
And say,
so I wonder if the question's about that kind of information.
Okay.
Is that what you're looking for? Is the because you can obviously speak to it more, but Google collects a lot of demographic and other advertising type information,
Sure.
Where they can guess things about you, and some things aren't a guess. But I guess that's really the question. That's what Google does.
All right, but I think this is...
No, I resist that and resist that last statement. We do a lot of different things. I'm not in the ads side of things at all. I'm in the protect the users side of things at all. So we do a lot of stuff to protect our users, and so that's kind of why I'm in this part of the business. Mm-hmm. I am very appreciative of the fact that our ads business works really well because it gives me the resources to do this, and I acknowledge this full well.
Yeah, I didn't want to imply that that's all Google does, but that's one of Google's main products, is that.
Absolutely, we are an advertising company in very many ways, yes.
So you do other great things as well.
So, but that said, this goes actually back to the last question about user tools, because I know that Facebook has this too. I'm not sure what Twitter has it at a different level, but you all have it too. You actually can go into your account and see what Google knows about you, and you can sometimes change preferences. You can, I know on Twitter just upgraded their, I don't think they call it security check. I think it's just in the settings. You can see what they think you're interested in, and you can take them off or change them. Those controls are getting more granular. And in fact, on Facebook, you can archive every post you've ever had and put it in a file and save it. So there are different, I don't think people are aware of the ways you can actually interact. That was your point earlier, but I think there's some pretty granular places that you can do this, right? And see and understand. So I think that's a good thing. We're very strong advocates of consumers sort of owning their online presence to the degree that they can, change these things or correct them, or say, yeah, I was interested in cars 6 months ago, but I bought a car. I'm no longer interested in cars, right? I'm interested in something else.
Sure. So, one of the things we did first, many, many years ago, was allow you to take all your data out because we believe your data is yours.
The Data Liberation Front.
Absolutely. Yep. Those are my homies. But I also think it's important to look at the evolution of where that went. So I don't know how many of you heard recently There's a problem with a production run of Google Home Mini devices, where the device thought that you were constantly pushing on the top, and it was sending an awful lot of audio back into the cloud. And a journalist discovered this. The tool that the journalist used to discover this was one of our own transparency tools. So they used a tool that we had designed to give our users the best possible understanding of what we believed and knew about them. And he saw this and he said, there is no way that this device should be sending all this stuff to Google. And he reported it to us. We literally, this was on a Friday afternoon at 4 p.m. He was not, he wrote, I mean, it's an entertainingly written article, and if you're interested in this stuff, I encourage you to read it. Because he's like, you know, I sent this late Friday afternoon, I was expecting a response by Monday maybe. So 10 minutes later, he had the first email response. That evening, after he had had his dinner party, one of our team actually drove over to his home to pick up the device so we could actually assess what was going on with the device. A whole lot of people lost their weekends because of the importance of not merely the transparency, but the privacy sensitivity of something like this. This is not something that is trivial to us in any possible way. And if you don't trust our services, you're not going to trust anything about this company. And so that's why we build these tools. If you want to close your Google account, we have entire systems that are staffed, engineers, you know, they cost money to us to allow you to take all your data and go and take your data where you want to take it. And we've had those for years, precisely because that is a cornerstone belief of what we do. So absolutely, there's a lot of information about you, but we expose it. We will tell you, if you see an ad with that little blue triangle and you click on that, that will bring you to ads preferences, and it will say, this is what we have intuited about you. What's interesting is we've done user studies with that user interface, with ads preferences. And more often than not, when people go and visit that, they will actually give us more information to provide more effective advertising. This is totally counterintuitive because humans have told us so many different ways that they don't like this stuff. But if you give them a way to communicate and say, you know what, I am buying a blender, and they will tell us, and suddenly they start seeing blender ads, and then they know, hey, I told them that I'm buying a blender, so it makes sense to get blender ads. So if you provide the right kind of tools, whether it's security checkup, privacy checkup, ads preferences, all of these things, it also becomes a lot more comprehensible. And that's another part of security and this whole notion of security humanism. You need to get people to understand it, which is why you need to educate folks. All of this stuff, none of this is magic. You know, I have an entirely separate rant about nation-state actors that, I don't know, maybe we'll get to. But, you know, they're not magical either. So did that kind of sort of answer your question? Because I don't want to leave that question unanswered. Okay.
Can I just say, just to one of your points just quickly, so Michael Daniel, who used to be the cybersecurity coordinator for President Obama, said one reason for the United States to be better at, and I'm paraphrasing here, this is not an exact quote of him, is us to get better because he would like to get his nights and weekends back. Because the guys were always going after him. So maybe that's an argument for good security right there.
No, I would second that because we get this where somebody will find out that they think there's a problem with their product. And it's invariably on 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. And so, yeah, to your point though, responsible companies take this seriously. So yeah, there's no doubt about it. We're going to lose that weekend to fix that problem as quickly as we can. And I think, you know, trust is a key to our benefit from technology. That trust has to be earned and it has to be maintained. And companies that are serious about that will do the right thing.
Yeah. We have a question over here.
Hi, my name is Danny Bahar from the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. I actually want to follow up a little bit and put it, like, specify the question also in the context of this conversation. So I think one example could be if I'm emailing with my brother using Gmail that I need to buy a car. Will I see, like, in my next Google search, ads for a Toyota or a Honda? But in the context of this conversation, the question is, like, within the company, like the relationship between the company and its users, where is the line in which you provide the user the security that it needs for its data not to be used for profit? So I think because there's a little bit of, in theory at least, of a conflict of interest between the company that wants to make profit, and it's completely legitimate, and the information that is receiving from the user in a way which is not directly given to the company. So I think that I don't know if that's my question. I don't know if you can get to that.
So I can instantly answer part of it, which is we've announced that we are not going to be running any advertising in Gmail anymore. So you will not see ads within Gmail anymore.
I mean, if you do a Google search afterwards, yeah.
Hang on. So that's one element, and that was actually an element that was very disconcerting to very many people. But there's an interesting challenge, and it's a very interesting security challenge. A lot of people were very unsettled by the fact that, ooh, Google scans your emails. This does not sound good. Except that one of the main reasons that people use Gmail is because our anti-spam is really, really good. And our anti-malware on email is really, really good. Well, guess what? The only way you get that is because we have machines that have to scan the email. So
I think
this is part of the problem there, is educating that there is nuance between the do you scan for keywords in order to run ads, or do you scan in order to prevent bad stuff from landing in your inbox? Ultimately, it's all machines running software doing the scanning, but there used to be this blanket unease about, oh my gosh, email scanning. So that's one issue. I honestly couldn't tell you right now whether or not at any point in time, before I joined Google, while I've been at Google, exactly how that stuff works, because it's constantly changing. Because we are also constantly evaluating what constitutes value for the user at any given time. And what you see, the behavior that you can reproduce at any given time, is a direct relationship to what we currently believe is most beneficial to the user. I truly don't know. Right now, if you have an email exchange with your brother about cars, and you go and you search for something, is it going to have a car bias? I honestly don't know, because that's not my thing. What I do know is that when you log into your Gmail account, we are going to make sure it is you, and we are going to go to great lengths to make sure it is not some fisher from halfway across the world trying to get at your contact list, because that is my problem.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up? Yeah, now go back to you, Steve, but because there's I learned this recently, and I didn't know this, that actually when you're using your online, Gmail online, and you open up and you preview a document before you open, it's actually better protected. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you get an attachment that's, say, an Office file, we will render it on the server. The only thing that gets pushed down to you is pixels, so you only see graphics. So if there is any bad payload in that Office document or whatever that document was, and we can render it, same thing with PDFs. You are actually more protected, because if that payload does anything, it's going to do it in a sandbox on our hardware. It's not even going to get down to your machine. That's one of the reasons why Chromebooks are so useful in that regard.
Yeah,
as well.
I wasn't aware of that until recently. I think it would be something I would know, but I didn't. I think that is actually, that is something people should know, because especially people who are using Gmail and getting documents sent to them, which is a huge attack vector, right? That there's some protection of not downloading it, but just viewing it. Anyway, I don't know, Stephen, you might have had something.
No, it was to again, to this point of trust. There's been some controversy in the press recently about, did a certain antivirus program look at documents on somebody's computer? And first of all, there's a tremendous amount of ignorance and misinformation been circulated around that. But the bottom line is, to Stephan's point, if you want somebody to secure you, you're going to have to trust them. I mean, if you have a Secret Service agent assigned to you, they're going to know an awful lot about your life. And so it's a question of trust. And really, as you evolve your strategy around security and IT in general, you have to look at the company that's doing the work. How, are they trustworthy? What's their reputation? And yeah, if you take our security product and put it on your system, we're going to have a lot of access to your system. We have zero interest in abusing that access or anything other than security, because that's just not a sustainable model. But yeah, as you go out there, and we've been talking about putting security programs together, it's not just looking at product review and how the product scores, but how is the company that's selling you the product score? What's their reputation? Are they trustworthy?
Did you have something you wanted to add?
Well, I just wanted a quick comment that kind of fell into when I was mentioning business email compromise earlier, just because I think this is something that is a potential threat to journalists in general. Business email compromise is also known as a CEO fraud. It's a really common scam these days. And essentially what's happening is somebody's getting access to an email account, usually through phishing, often through malicious documents, the exact sort of thing you're trying to protect us from with the preview. And what somebody's doing in a lot of these cases is they're gaining access to an email account and they're living in that email account anywhere from days to weeks to months, harvesting information and looking for the right time to strike. Now, against most companies with this, they're usually looking for some kind of business deal. Somebody's just closed a deal with a contractor to do renovation. And at this point, the attacker impersonates the CEO and said, hey, look, we actually, we need to change this vendor quickly. We need to wire $10,000 over to their account immediately. I'm going to be on a plane for the next 3 hours. Can you make sure it's been wired by the time I land? The email looks like it came from the CEO, and the person in accounts payable sends it out, and the money's gone. And so this is one of the things where I think that with journalists, you still have that same kind of thing. You have the phishing emails, you have the malicious documents, and you even have sources that could be compromised if somebody gets into your email through one of these methods and just hangs out in there. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind, is that when we're talking about these things and even the inconvenience of some of them, it's to make it harder for the attacker. And just this concept that somebody can live in your email for months looking for the right time to strike is pretty scary.
And this is why monitoring is a good thing. To the gentleman earlier who was asking about compliance versus, it's like this is the kind of stuff you look for. And if you have both the tooling and the people and who have the instincts to find this kind of stuff, that's real security. That's not compliance.
I've also heard in this particular kind of cases too that people sometimes add yet another process. So it's like, yeah, okay, you can email me an invoice and you can send me an invoice and tell me to pay it, but we're gonna have an offline process that follows. I mean, if it's over a certain amount, you have to call, you call the person and say, hey, did you send it? Pretty simple security measure, right? Could be done, and I've seen this in, there have been a lot of scams around this in people that do lending for buying housing and mortgages and stuff, right? Because there's all these big wire transfers that are occurring right before someone buys a house. So really the bad guys try to get in there and it's like, ooh, well, it's closing's happening, send me the money, right? So they're seeing these, adding back in. So I don't know if you had another comment there, but let's go back to the questions.
Could Stephan talk again, go over again why previewing an attachment is a good idea? And is the security aspects you were talking about, does that relate to the email account, or does that relate to the browser? And are some email accounts better than others and some browsers better than other, or generally they're all more or less the same?
Wow.
Can I just say, I have no relationship, business relationship, or a personal business relationship with Google. I would say that Google Chrome, in my objective research, is the most secure browser. And there's been a number of studies recently that the Consumer Reports Organization in the United States has sponsored, looking at how security is handled in different browsers. But I would say everybody should do their due diligence on what they think and look at independent tests of security to decide. But I would say it as an organization, we recently put everybody onto Chrome versus other things that we've been using.
So as somebody on the Chrome team, that of course pleases me to no end. But also we don't make money off of Chrome, so it's like, I have no profit motive. What I do have a very strong motive is a user protection motive. And so, again, and in addition to my humanism leanings, I also have strong economic leanings. And we are all economists at heart, and one of the things that Chrome did very early on, which at the time was quite unpopular, was we started a vulnerability rewards program. You showed up on a doorstep with a security vulnerability in our stuff, and we give you money. That's the deal. And we've been running these programs, and there are not many of them, since 2010, and they're very successful because it helps us. I mean, we're fairly good at finding problems of our own, but of course having the world find problems and be able to be remunerated for these is even better. And so during the course of the year, there are different security conferences, and there are occasionally also security competitions. One is called Pwn to Own, which is specifically about compromising browsers. And this year, for the second year running, Chrome was not compromised. All the others were. And so that's kind of cool. We like hearing that because it means that we're doing the right thing, and we're actually moderately good at our jobs because we're preventing people from exploiting our browser for money. So are all browsers created equal? Absolutely not. That's not the case. Have browsers all been getting better over the years? Absolutely so. So, you know, if you're using a modern browser, in most cases, you are protected. You are in better shape. The browsers differ in certain respects, and some of these vulnerabilities that get exploited in these particular competitions tend to be the kind of things that only very, very high-end attackers would be using in the first place. So if you feel that you're potentially in the crosshairs of somebody on the high-end side, then yeah, it really should matter. We also like to think that from a Chrome perspective, we have more features that are more useful to more people. So in the case of the document preview that Michael described, that works if you're in Gmail, regardless of the browser.
But you have to be in the online Gmail inbox, right? It doesn't work with, I mean, that's the thing, you're in your Gmail, you preview it, and it's protected.
As opposed to running it through Outlook or...
For example,
Yeah,
right,
exactly.
absolutely.
Just to the point of secure browsers, we think Chrome is very good. However, with our security software, we include a special browser for doing financial transactions. It's a totally limited browser. So if you're using our product and you're going to go to you go to bankofamerica.com, it will pop up and say, do you want to use the ESET financial browser to do that? But I think to the point of the preview thing, to get your users to the level where they understand things like, okay, downloading a document, what does that mean to the system? You know, opening a document, what are the risks around that? And what should people be looking for in terms of identifying the documents that come attached that they shouldn't open? Because yeah, if it is an infected document and you open it on your system, you're probably going to see the document, but in the background, then the malicious code is dropping onto your computer and you don't see it, it just goes there and does its thing.
All right, so we're basically out of time, but I do want to ask one more question, because I think it's important. We've sort of been talking about security as being, you know, happening on a certain environment, but journalists are on the go, right? Journalists don't, I mean, they're sometimes at their desks, I hope, but often they're not, right? They're on the go, and you know, they're either out reporting in the field, they're interviewing people, maybe they're filing stories from wherever. So I just, you know, a quick, and this will be our last question, just a quick thought on like mobile. Like, is there something else? We've talked about a lot of different things. Is there something we've left out about mobile that they should know about or think about? Just, you know, for that environment, which is so critical to this industry.
Well, I brought show and tell, so that's a 4G hotspot. I haven't used the hotel's Wi-Fi or the conference Wi-Fi because I'm paranoid, and I also used to work with a company actually based in Salt Lake City that did hotel networks. And there's some scary stuff out there. But no, use your own connectivity, use a virtual private network. There's some good virtual private network software out there so that you're tunneling from your remote system across the internet encrypted. And make sure there's a password on this. You know, to Stephan's very important point, some of it's really simple. You still see people and they pick up their phone and it's on. It's like, well, if you left that on the plane, I would then own that. No, I wouldn't, but I would turn it in. But.
Any other thoughts on that?
I think part of when we talk about mobile and when we talk about security in general is this concept of trust. And you know, you're mentioning that you don't trust the hotel Wi-Fi. And think about that. You go to a coffee shop in, you know, Bogota, in Mexico City, in Provo, in Washington, D.C., you know, in Toronto. Do you trust the person running that network and that they're going to do the right thing with your data? And so the answer hopefully is no. So you have options like this. You can use VPNs. Obviously, if you're attaching to Gmail, it's encrypted with TLS, and it should be okay. But I mean, there's still levels of this. So you really need to figure out which level of trust you're comfortable with, and then come up with a working paradigm that enables you to get what you need done, but in a manner that you believe is safe and and effective no matter where you are. And I know it's tempting to sometimes just jump on that open Wi-Fi and do something really quickly, but depending on how your system's configured and what you're doing, that could be a pretty costly mistake.
And so this is, I think, the first time where I'm going to disagree with my fellow panelists here, because I think with a VPN, you're just shifting your trust to the VPN provider. And unless you really know your VPN provider, suddenly all you're doing is moving risk around. So this is why this stuff is actually not easy. And so in my case, I have a phone that is fully patched up. It's up to date. I am connected to the hotel network because I am both lazy and I trust my colleagues that the device in my pocket is up to date and is not susceptible to typical attacks. And so we have, I mean, we could spend hours on this notion of different enterprises also handle their risk very differently. We have a philosophy basically called Beyond Corp, where we decided many years ago that there is no perimeter. There are no firewalls. It makes no sense because people are so mobile. We need to support mobile devices from phones to laptops, but we also want to make sure that the user experience for the employee is very consistent, yet at the same time, we have so much data from our users. We must be good stewards of this data. So how do we make sure that we can have a mobile workforce, but we can also protect our users' data? There's a ton of information out there that we've made available about how we think about this. Robert's point was absolutely on point. When I connect to Google services, I know that connection is encrypted. So between my endpoint device and Google, that's an encrypted pipe, which is one of the reasons why I don't really have a problem with the hotel net or many airport networks. I have some issues with some other airport networks, but for other reasons. So it all depends. You need to evaluate for yourself what your risks are and what the right mitigations are and what the right cost benefit is. How much hassle is appropriate? Because if you crank hassle up too far, people will work around it. And there have been some very noticeable breaches. I'm thinking of a particular North American government in one of their financially oriented ministries had a very serious breach because their security policy was far too stringent, which meant that the employees figured out a way around this policy, and they basically violated the policy because they couldn't get any work done. And as a direct result of forcing the employees into violating the policy, sure enough, the adversary came in, and that particular department was off the internet, according to public reports, for almost a year, because that's how long it took to clean up that mess. So you can totally overdo it. If you piss off your users, they will find a way to do what they want to do. So there is absolutely no place also for just being overly energetic.
Well, before I hand it back over, I just want to give my thanks to this panel. You guys, fantastic. I hope this advice was helpful to people. Probably can still answer some questions on the margins here for a little bit of some of the specific stuff. So
yeah, and check out. I mean, like I said, my colleague Dario is at a table right outside those doors with the advanced protection kits, and you can pick one up, and he will in fact register. There's at least one, if not two, computers out there right now, and he can teach you how to register and how to get it set up. So before you even leave here, you can have your Google accounts much, much better protected.
Hands-on help from Google doesn't happen live in person all the time, so that's a very special thing to have. So let's give the panel a big hand.
Thank you.
And we'll hand it back over.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Stephen. And thank you, Stephan. Very nice. Next up, following right after this, will be our last panel of the day.